Horus prevails. Horus becomes king and represents the king. But this doesn't mean that Set isn't lurking there in the background, because that hero also doesn't die. Horus, as I mentioned, becomes identified with the idea of kingship early on in Egyptian history. The unification of the two Egypts, of Upper and Lower Egypt, sees the Horus symbol as the symbol of unification. And when the pharaoh was crowned, Horus was invoked. This tied together divinity and kingship. I'd like to read you a text from a coronation ceremony. This is from the 18th dynasty. That is in the 15th century BC. And we are going to listen to a text read at the coronation of the great pharaoh Amenhotep III of Egypt. Live the Horus, strong bull appearing as justice, he of the two ladies, establishing laws and causing the two lands to be pacified. Horus of gold, mighty of arm when he smites the Asiatics. Notice that Horus is a warrior also. His contendings with Set are a model for the actions of the pharaoh. The pharaoh not only has divine kingship, he can use the attributes of the god and best his enemies. And this specific king and his dynasty were great conquerors. So this is historically relevant. Again, tying together the mythic and the historic. To continue, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Nefer Cheperu Ra Wa En Ra, son of Neb Mat Ra, lord of truth like Ra, son of Ra Amenhotep, Hekwase, ruler of Thebes, given life. Mighty bull, lofty of plumes, favorite of the two goddesses, great in kingship in Karnak, golden hawk, wearer of diadems in the southern Heliopolis, king of Upper and Lower Egypt. So the king is Horus, manifest. The king dies, the king is Osiris. Another text from the coronation speaks of the crown, of the diadem of the crown, and of the fact that the gods, Horus among them, love to look on the pharaoh. Now the pharaoh is both a god and he's looked on by the gods. Hail to thee, thou who art in peace, Lord of joy, crowned form, Lord of the Waweret crown, exalted of plumes, beautiful of diadem, exalted of the white crown. The gods love to look upon thee. The double crown is established upon thy brow. This is the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. The two kingdoms, the two areas are unified. The kingdom that results is symbolized by the fusion of the crowns. So Horus, our symbol of kingship, reigns in a sense throughout 3,000 years of Egyptian history. Osiris, as we saw in the texts of the dead, remains the god of the dead, but curiously, he's also the god of fertility. Now, this might not seem to go together. Shouldn't you have a separate god for fertility? The grain, when placed in the earth, undergoes a sort of death and rebirth. It dies as seed, it's reborn as plant. Osiris symbolizes this death and rebirth. The Nile, the source of all life in Egypt, is thought of as the tears of Isis that she weeps over her husband. She's mourning for Osiris. So you can see how the gods here are brought into the depiction of the underlying cosmic reality of the natural world. Now, Egypt is particularly fascinating because you would think that the stories I just told you about, this pantheon, would be enough to satisfy the religious imagination. Well, that's a very good story about where we came from, how come we have a king, why is there a river? It's the tears of Isis. Okay, now let's study another culture. No. As Egypt develops, there's layering. We have another set of ideas. We can't say there's any one grand idea, except that there should always be another idea. So we have the god Ra, or Re. We have more than one system, and Ra dominates the whole system, but it's also a system that interpenetrates with the Horus, Isis, Osiris system. Ra is called the Horus of the horizon, and he's seen as one of the primary creator gods. He's identified with the sun, with the disk of the sun, and at one point the idea of Ra is fused with the idea of Horus, and we get the sun with wings, the winged sun disk, which we see in many Egyptian temples. He plays a part in the resurrection of Osiris and his elevation to king of the underworld. And he, Ra, is understood to be involved in the lives of all humans. So if we think of Horus as the god whose interaction is with the kingly realm, Ra has interaction with the human realm, with the more mundane realm, and he judges humans after their death. And in the iconography, Ra is seated, and he's assisted by a goddess, Ma'at, who is symbolized by a feather on the top of her head, a single feather. She's the goddess of truth. Her feather is weighed against the human heart to achieve a balance. Ra is the sun. He emerges as a beetle, that fusion of the sun symbol and the scarab beetle. On the eastern horizon, he moves across the sky to sunset. At night, he's swallowed by the goddess Nut, the great sky goddess, and she delivers him at dawn every morning. So here too, in the story of Ra, we have a cyclical pattern that is joined with the Horus idea. Let us contrast this very complex and rich pantheon with some Mesopotamian ideas about kingship. Now, I'll remind you that in Egypt, as layered and fascinating as it is, it's a unified culture over 3,000 years of time. In Mesopotamia, we have a succession of cultures. They might last for centuries, they are replaced. We spoke of Mesopotamia as the more open culture. Open in the sense that one could invade it, one could take it over. It was open to influence, it could influence others. Egypt was the more closed culture. So what is the picture of the gods in Mesopotamia? Again, as with Egypt, we're looking at a selection. I've chosen 6 gods from each pantheon. I could choose 60, but that would be more than one lecture. So let's look at 6 gods. Gods in Mesopotamia are associated with cities. They, as in Egypt, they could be local, and then they move to a national level. And they also represent natural forces. As in Egypt, we have the storm god Hadad, or Adad in Mesopotamia. The inhabitants of any given city were supposed to serve their god. That was their function. And we will begin with the god Enlil. He was worshipped in Nippur. He's credited with the idea of separation, the separation and organization of the earth. And he rules heaven and earth. We will hear more about him in a subsequent lecture on creation epics. Enki, or Ea, is a god we've met already in a previous lecture. I've called him the organizing god, or the god of administration. Well, that sounds a bit boring, but he has some more interesting jobs. He's also the god of the deep, the god of the ocean. And when gods threaten humanity, he comes to their aid. We read a section of the flood tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In that story, Ea, or Enki, comes to humanity in the form of Utnapishtim, the Babylonian Noah, as he was called by modern scholars, and warns him that there will be a flood. So Ea is a god who can intervene. He's not the god who's removed. He's the god, Ea, or Enki, who brings writing to humanity. the greatest gift of the gods. And with writing comes science, comes medicine, comes astronomy. Now, this is not my abstraction. This is what the Mesopotamians said. They said that writing enabled all of these other crafts of civilization. Anu, who we've heard about in a number of myths, he's a removed god, sometimes described as the father of Enki and of Enlil. He doesn't interfere in the affairs of humanity, and some scholars have pointed out that Anu is an ancient version of the deist idea. The deist idea in European intellectual history, which posits that there is a divine being, but that divine being is removed from the affairs of humanity. In a colloquial term, it's a god who checked out, a god who's not directly involved. Anu symbolizes that god. He doesn't deign to deal with humanity. Of course, in the Mesopotamian pantheon, there are other gods who will do just that. They're more intimately involved with humans. Now, I've mentioned gods. I need to mention goddesses. There's Ninhursag, the mother of the gods. She's the sister of Enlil. There are many wonderful stories associated with her and with her children. And it's her offspring that show compassion for humanity. So she's the mother god in the sense both that she's an all-encompassing goddess figure, and she's a mother goddess in the sense that her children, so there's a degree of remove, not the goddess herself, but her offspring are able to help people. Of course, there are other offspring who harm people. The Mesopotamians love to explain the human predicament by the actions of these different gods. And this brings us to Inanna, known in Akkadian as Ishtar. Inanna was her Sumerian name. She's associated with the planet Venus and is the goddess of war and of sexual activity. In a way, she's also the goddess of fertility that results from sexual activity. Her sacred animal was the lion, and she's often depicted as standing on a lion. And she, too, was local, and then national, and then international. She's definitely one of those gods and goddesses that achieved international, in the sense of Middle Eastern international fame, because she's worshipped in many other cultures, sometimes under different names. Her city, one of her cities, was Uruk, Warka, also known as Erech or Erech in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis. And you'll recall that Uruk was the city of Gilgamesh, the great hero. In the epic, Ishtar, Inanna, falls in love with Gilgamesh, the divine human figure, and wants him to be her lover. He, Gilgamesh, rejects her. He tells her that he remembers her cruelty to her spouse, Dumuzi or Tammuz. He does not want any part of her love. And because of his rejection of her, the goddess is furious and punishes him in a dire fashion, which we will see when we investigate further the great epic of Gilgamesh. And I need to mention the god Marduk, the son of Enki. He's the god of Babylon, who is featured in the Enuma Elish, the great Babylonian epic, which also has a creation account in it. And his kingship of the younger gods symbolized the great power of Babylon over other cities in Mesopotamia. So we can see that the gods were organized in pantheons in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that the differing ideas of society and religion are reflected differently in Egypt and Mesopotamia. In Egypt, we have an identification of divinity with kingship. The pharaoh is the god. In Mesopotamia, we have the kings as appointed by the gods and the goddesses.